Welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we get started, a quick note to our listeners that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the show or even leaving a positive review. It really does help sustain our work. And if you'd like to explore all the other topics we've covered in the past, you can find a full archive of the show at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to one of our listeners, Ed Brandon of Ottawa, Ontario, who wrote in to ask about transcripts of our podcast episodes. It's a good opportunity to flag for everyone that we do publish partial transcripts of our interviews, which are usually available on our site the day after the episode goes live. We're also hoping to get to a place in the future where we can regularly publish full transcripts of each episode. So thanks to Ed for that feedback. Now on to today's topic. Voters in Germany will go to the polls in September for elections that will be unusually consequential to the country's foreign and national security policy. Chancellor Angela Merkel is retiring after almost 16 years in the position, so the country will have a new leader, and the political winds are shifting in favor of the Green Party, which is widely seen as a major contender to enter government as part of a coalition in the fall. That would also allow them to potentially exercise influence on Germany's approach to foreign policy and defense. My guest today has been closely keeping an eye on all this from Berlin, where she's based. Dr. Claudia Major is head of the International Security Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She's also a friend of the show who's been on with us in the past, and we're thrilled to have her back on. Claudia, welcome.
Thank you. Very nice to be here again.
So maybe you could start by setting the scene for us a little bit in terms of what's driving the popularity of the Green Party in Germany, and how do you assess the likelihood of them being a part of the next government?
So as it stands now, it's indeed very likely that the Greens will participate in the next government. In the moment, what we observe is a certain hype. So the Greens are overtaking the Conservative and the other parties in the polls. And so if you look at recent polls, 7th of May, there was one where the Greens got 26 intentions of the percent of the intention of votes, the Conservatives 23, and the Social Democrats 14. So there's really a kind of great and successful moment for the Greens in the moment. But even if they were to lose a little bit, and if this current hype might cool down a little bit, it's very likely that they will be part of the next government, because in the German political system, you need coalitions. No party is usually able to run a government alone. They need coalition partners to have the required majority. So a coalition party ahead with a green participation, and that's very important because entering government for the Greens or for every other party doesn't mean that everything will be possible. So the German coalition government system means you need a lot of compromise and a lot of consensus, and that will limit how much any party is actually able to implement its own agenda. I'm insisting on that so much because sometimes in the commentaries now you hear something like, oh, there's a green takeover and everything will change. No, this will be part of the kind of traditional German coalition making. So you need compromise and you need consensus to get your ideas through.
And could you just talk a little bit about the role of the Chancellor candidate that the Greens have put forward, Annalena Baerbock, and what kind of figure she is?
That's actually an interesting move, because for the first time ever, the Greens nominated a candidate for the chancellery. Usually they didn't. So that's already a political statement in nominating a candidate. They follow there the kind of the Conservative Party and the Social Democrats, who all have their candidate nominated. The smaller country, the smaller don't do it in that way. Annalena Baerbock is fascinating in that she comes from a different generation than the other candidates. Olaf Scholz for the Social Democrats and Armin Laschet for the Conservatives. She incarnates this international, staunch Europeanist approach of the party. She comes with a new way of doing politics in terms of style, but also in terms of content. So she's really different to the kind of traditional candidates we have seen in that field.
Now, in terms of foreign and defense policy particularly, how have the Greens traditionally fit into this consensus that has emerged in Germany since the end of the Cold War?
If you look back a little bit to the history of the Greens, they have very much evolved. They had very radical origins as a pacifist, anti-NATO totally protest party in the 1980s. They had their 40th birthday just some time ago. So they started with very radical origins, protest, pacifist, anti-NATO. Then they had some, I would call it radical pains when they entered government for the first time in 1998 until 2005, which was really a transformative moment for the Greens. The pacifist roots, ideas clashed with the realities of a government. For example, the then foreign minister of the Greens, Joschka Fischer, took the party, the Green Party, into the Kosovo War as one country participating in a NATO campaign. That was the first time Germany's military has been deployed in a conflict since World War II. So from a very radical origin, a kind of transformative moment in government, 1998 to 2005, now they have become a rather moderate party with an increasing electoral success and moving out from the little niche into the center of the society. And to a large extent, actually, they now fit the consensus on foreign policy. So they agree on the necessity of the European Union, they always had. They accept NATO. They focus on multilateralism. So they kind of come into the center of the foreign policy debates. But there are obviously some major differences. What I find always important to say is that they have largely remained true to some of their founding principles. So strong focus on human rights, peaceful multilateralism, diplomacy, committed to peace, development, preventive foreign policy, and all that, desire for nuclear disarmament. But they considerably moved on others. They rejected Bundeswehr deployments in their very, very early days. They accept them now, although they scrutinize them very closely. They accept that military deployments can be necessary. They accepted NATO, they accepted the transatlantic relationship, and they promised to securely fund the German military. So to a large extent, they arrived at the consensus. So this is important to underline. They are not the odd one out in the German party landscape. For example, if you take the Green stance on nuclear issues or nuclear deterrence, where they're very critical, also the Social Democrats are critical and the Liberals. The Greens want a stricter approach to arms exports. The same applies to the Social Democrats. So sometimes you read in the commentaries analysis of the Green foreign policy program, and you might think, oh, these are real kind of very different positions to the German mainstream. I wouldn't say that. I think they're very much on many positions in the center of the debates, with again some exceptions. But this is not this kind of odd one out or very special position. That's not exceptional in the landscapes. In many regards, they're really close to the SPD, which is currently the Social Democrats, who are currently in power.
And what about on relations with China and Russia? Are they part of the consensus there, or do they have views that diverge a little bit on how to approach relations with those countries?
That's actually interesting, because you picked you picked the two topics where the Greens really pledged to make a difference. That's particularly on China, Russia, and something like Nord Stream 2 and disarmament. China, this is where we can really expect a change. What the Greens want is an approach based on dialogue, on I would call it robustness. So, for example, they want a much tougher stance on human rights. They have been critical on the EU agreement, the EU-China investment agreement, for example. And they also want to have certain repercussions on the economic ties. They call, for example, to diversify the markets for the German companies. They also call for diversify the imports to Germany and to increase resilience. If you look at what the Conservative Party usually says with regard to China, they are far more reluctant. They have far more kind of convergence approach, that cooperation with China has to be a bit more balanced. They are reluctant to politicize the economic questions, what the Greens are happy to do. And they're really reluctant to impose anything on companies. So China is indeed something where the Greens are very tough. They're generally very tough on authoritarian regimes, Russia, China, for example, also on Hungary in the European Union, Viktor Orban. So this is where you can still see the kind of initial very strong focus on human rights and on a certain normative dimension.
I want to zoom out a little bit now to ask you, what do you think the primary challenges are that face Germany in the defense and national security realm? And to what extent are those challenges prompting a rethink, if you will, of the traditional foreign policy consensus that we've been talking about?
If you look at Germany's foreign and security policy, you obviously have the overarching questions that all European countries are facing. How are we going to organize the transatlantic relationship? How we are going to deal with Russia? How we are going to deal with China? How does Europe position itself in the great power competition between the US and China? What role for Europe? So these overarching questions are obviously also questions that the next German government has to address. If you look a bit more specifically in the area of defense, I think we have four typical German issues that the next government would need to address. And the first is a lack of understanding of defense as a resource of power and international relation. That sounds a bit abstract, but what I want to say is that many German political elites struggle to recognize that hard power, military hard power, has again become a key part of global power disputes. So if you want to respond to this changing balance of international power, like US and China, and if you want to deal or play a role in the systemic competition, you have to understand that issue of military power, and you have to be able to play this card alongside diplomatic and economic tools. So understanding the role of military power, of defense as a power resource, not to say that helps and solves everything, far away from that, but just understand that this has a certain role to play. The second typical German problem is the low readiness of the armed forces. We have decades of underinvestment, poor management, lack of political attention, and this all has affected the Bundeswehr, German armed forces, and the availability of forces for both collective defense and operations. So low readiness of armed forces, which really needs to be addressed. The third typical German problem is a very difficult, or I would even say, wrecked procurement system. So we have an overregulated, outdated system that currently doesn't allow us to swiftly improve our capabilities. So it's not only a question of how much we spend on defense, and we could certainly do better, but it's also, are we actually able to spend it effectively and wisely? And this is where we struggle. And the fourth thing, or the first issue for Germany, is the lack of public support. It's quite curious to see when you have polls about where the public whom the public trusts. The armed forces usually rank pretty highly, but what the armed forces do, so the typical work of a soldier, doesn't get much support. So there is a kind of misunderstanding of what armed forces do, and that the Bundeswehr is mainly a force dedicated to deterrence, and it's not kind of global intervention force. So I think these are kind of typical German issues that the next government would need to address, in addition to the kind of global questions of transatlantic relationship, Russia, China, great power competition, and that.
On the issue of sort of realizing the role of hard power and its renewed importance, I wonder if the recent discussion in Berlin of sending a frigate to the Asia Pacific plays into that. I was pretty interested to see that announcement a couple months ago.
I think it's an interesting decision, and that Germany is actually looking beyond Europe and is recognizing that this region is playing a role. For me, it's an example of a tiny example of a broader development in German security and defense policy. And for me, it starts in 2014. For a long time, this traditional German restraint on international affairs, not exposing itself so much, was really the dominating scheme. And in 2014, at the Munich Security Conference, then President of the Republic, the Foreign Minister, and the Defense Minister, all three said that Germany should shoulder a greater international responsibility. And they all argued that a country like Germany, that is so deeply embedded in international exchanges of goods, of money, of people, and that benefits so greatly from international stability and from international relations, should stand up more and do more to preserve that international order and that international stability from that it benefits so greatly. And that, to some extent, would involve using military force. And this might sound very obvious to people in the US and France or in the UK, but for Germany, recognizing that you have a responsibility and not living up to this responsibility also means that you kind of have to pay a price was a really kind of real wake-up call. And starting from 2014, German defense policy effectively changed, probably a bit too little and too late, but there were real changements. For example, in the strategic documents, Germany got a new white book on defense in 2016, right after the annexation of Crimea and the war on Donbass, which focused again very much on collective defense. The defense spending increased. In 2013, Germany spent something like 33 billion. Now we are at, I think, 46 or 47 billions. That's quite an increase. Germany was very committed in NATO within the process of NATO adaptation after the annexation of Crimea and the war on Donbass in kind of returning to collective defense. So Germany is one of the countries leading one of the multinational battalion in the Baltics. Germany was supported the anti-IS operation after the Paris attacks. And it was very committed in pushing European defense a bit further with setting up the European Defense Fund, PESCO, and other instruments. So you could say since 2014, Germany has moved forward. Yes, one could also say that was mainly event-driven. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was really a shock for Germany. So that helped getting defense higher on the agenda. The Paris attacks in 2015 were an attack on our closest partner. That obviously pushed Germany to react. So you could say, rightly so, it's a little bit reactive. You could say some elements, the particularly difficult ones, nuclear issues, arms exports, defense industry, it's not yet really addressed in a sufficient way. But in the same time, if you think how long it takes a country to change its strategic culture, so a strategic culture is how a country behaves in defense policy, how it relates to the military, that usually takes a generation. So, you could say there has been change in the last, say, 7, 8 years. It's a bit little, it's a bit too late, but it's moving. And the frigate Bayern, who is going to the Indo-Pacific, might be one element in saying, yeah, it could take another route. Yeah, it could better cooperate with the Brits and the French over there. But still, it's a first step. So could try to take a positive perspective.
As you mentioned, the strategic culture of a country takes a generation to change, which segues perfectly into my next question about how the Greens might approach these challenges. And given that their leadership does come from a new generation, how much of a shift can we expect from them if they enter government as expected?
I think it's again important to underline that we will have a coalition government. We don't know yet how many parties, the Conservative and the Greens, and maybe the Liberals, we don't know. And we don't know yet who is going to be the junior partner and who is going to be the major partner. Are the Greens going to be the junior partner? Then they might have less influence. Or are they going to be the biggest party, which would confer to them more influence? So that we have still some unknowns out there. What is also safe to say is that, to a certain extent, security and defense matters. But the big issue for the Greens, obviously, are issues about climate, or is climate change. So I expect the debates about security and defense policy to be very controversial between potential coalition partners. I think that will be very heated. And finding compromise will not be easy, but I don't think it will hinder a coalition agreement. So it will not be the showstopper, to put it that way. Last point on that, if you have a coalition government, the ministries which you need to deliver defense, Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, Finances, Developed Cooperation, are usually run by ministers from different political parties. So again, there's compromise ahead. So even if you have now a very principled position, you need to find compromise in the end. So what could be examples where the Greens take very different positions to the Conservatives? The one, as we mentioned already, that's China. Here, the Greens really want to change the approach towards a tougher one, tougher with human rights, tougher with regard to economic relations, and also a kind of tougher approach on the European level, getting the other partners on board. Another interesting one is arms exports. The Greens call for far more restriction, and they want to write a new law on arms exports, something which the Conservative rejects. What exactly the Greens want, whether they want a national law, whether they want an agreement on the European level, it's not yet very clear. If you look at the election program or the draft election program, because the final program will only be approved in the middle of June, it's written in a way that you can engage in debates and find compromise. It's not very precise. It leaves a lot of room for maneuver. But again, China is an interesting one. Arms export, where the Greens are very strict, the Conservatives not. Nuclear issues are also a very difficult one. The Greens traditionally have been a nuclear disarmament, anti-nuclear party. But the wording in their draft election program goes in that direction, but remains a bit vague. They remain committed to signing the Ban Treaty, but at the same time, they praise NATO as a key security actor, which obviously includes nuclear deterrence. So this doesn't really fit. So they talk about a nuclear weapons-free world, but in the same time, they want to be a reliable partner in the alliance and in Europe. And many European countries still consider NATO with its nuclear deterrence as their life insurance. So there are some inherent tensions where you can see various positions in the draft election program, and sometimes one wonders how they can be reconciled. So just to give you another example, there's a lot of talk of equipping the armed forces, the Bundeswehr, in a correct way. But in the same time, the 2% spending goal in NATO is questioned. Obviously, the 2% spending goal is, in terms of metrics, a difficult one. But there's still a kind of tension and wanting to have a well-equipped Bundeswehr and putting the money where we would need it. There's a kind of tension between saying NATO is an essential, crucial pillar, but questioning nuclear deterrence. There's a tension between being tough on Russia, but not being very clear to what extent this toughness would include a military dimension. So that's going to be a very interesting debate.
You touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the intra-European and transatlantic dimensions, because you hear a lot of talk now in this post-Trump time, and it's a conversation that gained a lot of steam during the Trump era, I would say, of European strategic autonomy, and the idea that Europe needs to be more independent in pursuing its own defense capabilities. Where do the Greens fit into that kind of debate, and what kind of influence might they have on the discourse there?
The Green Party, as it is now, is a staunchly pro-European party. Annalena Baerbock, the Chancellor candidate, has worked in the European Parliament, so she also knows the European Union from the inside. But in the same time, you could say she has spent some time in the US and in the UK. So she kind of has a more global view on those international relations. But the party itself is staunchly pro-European, but in the same time recognizes a transatlantic relationship. This is something where they have moved from their very radical roots in the 1980s up to now. So pro-European, but recognizing the importance of the transatlantic relationship. I think that the debate about European strategic autonomy or European sovereignty is, to some extent, very often misunderstood as something directed against the US, which, in my understanding, and I have the impression that's also a little bit the Green direction, is it not. Also, generally speaking, from a German perspective, it is the idea that the European Union, as a big political entity, should have the ambition to be able to defend what it has constructed. In the moment, it can't. In military terms, the European countries are not, militarily speaking, able to defend what they have constructed. And that should shame us, Europeans, and that should worry us. If you understand sovereignty and European sovereignty or strategic autonomy in that way, it means to be able to formulate your own priorities, and have the capabilities to implement them. That means having a certain shaping ambition to shape the environment of the European Union. It means not being a kind of play ball between China and the US, but having an active role on its own. It means being able to defend its own interest alone where it's necessary, but with partners where possible. And the first partner of choice would obviously be the US, because you're always better off with partners. And that also means that strategic autonomy or European sovereignty is not a kind of freedom from the US. No, it's understood as a kind of freedom to do something, to enable the Europeans to define their priorities, to implement them, and to shape the environment according to their preferences. And that would always be better and easier with partners like the US, with whom we share so many interests, values, and ideas. So I think it's, for me, a major misunderstanding to see that European sovereignty, strategic autonomy debate as directed against the US. And if Europeans were serious about improving their defense capabilities, I'm putting it that way because I'm a bit disappointed on how little Europeans do on implementation. We are great on words, we are less good on implementation. So if Europeans were really serious about implementing and improving their military capabilities, it would turn them into a more attractive partner for the US. This is something what the whole burden sharing debate has been about over the last decades, since the start of NATO. So improving European capabilities would make us Europeans a more attractive partner to the US. It would allow also the US to do less in Europe. Europeans should be able to take care of their own backyard, which we haven't been able to do already in the 90s in the Balkan Wars. So much to progress in European defense. So a more attractive partner, and if the US would be engaged in other theaters, because the focus of the US is not longer Europe, it's more Indo-Pacific, Europeans would be able to do more in their own backyard or in the areas closer to Europe. So they would actually see those things as complementary. If Europeans would do more, the benefit would be for the Europeans and the Americans, who would have finally an attractive, reliable partner to do more in Europe or to join them in other theaters if the Americans would ask them for support. So that's a point I insist upon. It's not against the US. It's actually living up to our Europeans' own promises. Europeans have been promised in EU and NATO for years that they would do more for defense, but we haven't fulfilled our homework.
It's a good point. It's a really good point. And I think the overall environment is definitely conducive to the kind of dynamics you're talking about, especially with a president in the White House who is a very avowed transatlanticist, supporter of NATO, supporter of the European Union, and will be much more understanding and flexible and appreciative of these kinds of efforts, certainly more than his predecessor.
Maybe can I just add one point on the Greens?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes when you read now commentaries on Annalena Baerbock and the Poles and the Greens might taking over power in Germany, there's the impression that things wouldn't change fundamentally. And I think this is really a wrong impression. On the one hand, we have coalitions, and that requires compromise. So positions will be discussed, and in the end, there will be a compromise, and everybody will be able to live with that. So entering power doesn't mean you can implement 100% of your goals. The other point is that most positions, not all, but most positions of the Greens are not exceptional in the German political landscape. So they are in many regards very close to what the Social Democrats currently in government actually want. Nuclear disarmament, being critical on 2% defense spending, being critical on arms exports. We already have all those positions currently in government. So there's sometimes a certain fear or certain fascination, which I tend to think is exaggerated. What I find far more interesting is that we all often say in Germany that we are lacking a strategic debate, that's what I mentioned earlier, get the broader public on board, explain why security matters, explain why defense and military matters, what role they can play or can't play. How do military and civilian means relate to each other? And this is where a Green party in the coalition could make a real difference. That could be the necessary kick in the strategic debate that kicks the strategic debate in Germany forward. When the Greens were last in power from 1998 to 2005, the Green foreign minister convinced its party to participate in the Kosovo mission. These debates back then in 1999 were so utterly controversial and so heated, but it allowed actually to take those, I would even say, kind of dirty defense topics into the broader public and discuss it beyond the expert bubble and get the broader public involved. So I don't say it's going to be easy. I think it will be very difficult. But if it's about also advancing the strategic debate in Germany, taking it out of the expert bubble, this is where a Green government or the Green party in government, in a coalition, could make a real difference. And this is why I'm also looking very much forward to a potential government participation.
Looking ahead, the next few months to a year or so will be pretty exciting in Germany. There'll be the run-up to the election, the government formation process, and then the start of a new government. In a recent piece, you called these phases the 3 no-fun phases of German politics, which I thought was interesting. Maybe you could just talk about what your expectations are for how the Greens will navigate that and what kinds of roadblocks might arise in that process for them.
We actually defined 3 phases because usually you talk about the elections and then you expect things are kind of sorted. And I think we actually have 3 very different phases ahead in German politics. Focus very much on process and less on content. The first phase is the election campaign right now. Election campaigns usually tend to be a bit boring in Germany and only get really interesting in the last weeks before. But now, with this kind of major change ahead in German politics, it's already getting interesting. So Chancellor Merkel is not going to run again after 16 years. 16 years is really long. So there will be a new chancellor anyway. The Greens are likely going to enter the government. We will have a major change in the members of parliament, bringing in a new generation and potentially new positions. So the election campaign is going to be a bit more interesting. In terms of defense, I expect that the controversial topics like nuclear issues, arms exports, defense spending, and probably autonomous weapon systems are likely to play a role in the debate. These are not the most pressing topics in defense, but those are topics which are really, with which you can easily have a debate in Germany. They're so highly controversial. If you really want to tease or attack your political opponent, it's very easy to do so if you talk about defense spending against or in favor. If you talk about nuclear weapons against or in favor, you can make a normative argument. So those topics are really likely to play a role, not so much in order to solve it, but to have a controversial debate. So the first phase from now until September is the election campaign. Then comes the second phase, which are the coalition negotiations. The coalition negotiations are important because parties have to find an agreement on controversial issues. This compromise is put into a government program, the so-called coalition treaty. And it's interesting to see what language is used. How do you find the agreement on, for example, arms exports? Are we going to have a new law or not? Are we going to respect the 2% defense spending NATO rule or not? So this is going to be interesting. Usually in Germany, we had a new government before Christmas, but the last time a government was formed, it actually took us until spring of the next year. So the question is how quickly actually we are going to get a new government, because all the time the negotiations take place, we have a caretaker government who's not going to take the big strategic decisions that need to be taken. And then comes the third phase. You might think it's all over once we have the coalition treaty, but I think the actually really interesting bit is just starting once a new government is taking office, because then you have this fascinating phase where principled positions on human rights, on China, on Russia, on Nord Stream 2, on nuclear weapons, on arms exports hit reality. You can be very critical on arms exports and want to have a very strict law. But in the same time, if you are a very convinced European and you want to build with France the next generation fighter jet system, which needs to be exported, and is on the one hand the incarnation of a European defense project, but on the other hand has a kind of really difficult exportation issue, how do you decide? So the first months will be very much principled position meeting reality and clashing. And this will be a painful learning curve, not only for the new government, but also for all our partners. And this is an interesting one, particularly in Europe, because France, our most important partner in the European Union, is also having elections in April 2022. So when Germany kind of comes out of this whole election phase, has a new government and is ready to start, France is in the election campaign and is having the same moment of kind of, I don't know how you strategic hibernation, or I don't know what I'll call it. So this is why we call this the three no fun phases, because election campaign usually is not the moment for fact-based arguments. Then you have the coalition treaty, where you have to sort out your major positions. You have to distribute the power posts in the parliament. So you stuff all the committees, which is also important given that the Bundestag, the German parliament, has a key role to play in defense. It is authorizing the big procurement projects. It is authorizing deployments of the armed forces. So it's important who is in the committee. And then you have the first steps of the new government who has to find its way. The Greens have not been in federal government since 2005. It's a new generation in power now. They have been in government responsibility at the Länder level, so at the regional level, but not at the federal. So that's going to be really, really interesting for the next year or so.
Do you have any last thoughts on this that you'd like to leave us with?
I'm not sure whether it's so important, but what I found really interesting is that the Greens really make an effort in the moment to cover the international level. So Annalena Baerbock is making strong comments on international politics. When she talks about NATO, for example, or nuclear issues, she stresses that all those issues needs to be debated with our allies and partners. So it's a very reassuring approach, and an approach that shows we want to live up to the international responsibility that Germany has. We want to be a reliable partner, and we will do everything to be a reliable partner in EU and NATO. And that's to a certain extent also a big difference to the very roots of the Greens in the 80s, where they were this pacifist, anti-NATO, anti-military party. So they really have come a long way from a radical party via the government transformation 1998 to 2005 to a party now who still very, very still sticks to the main points like multilateralism, legal basis for international relation, human rights, but they have developed on certain issues like armed forces, NATO, and international responsibility. So I think this is important to understand. So they have been true to their fundamentals, but have developed in certain areas.
Claudia, thank you so much for making the time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, that was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. Claudia Major is head of the International Security Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's and 1 T. And Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.